Okay, so diving in here, we're looking at a pretty wild situation going down in a California courtroom. We've got this legal complaint, and it's pretty intense stuff. It's Gabriel Reed versus, well, a whole bunch of folks. Geez, Michael Patterson, Chanel Patterson, and then you got two church organizations, Restored Churches Worldwide, RCW for short, and the International Christian Churches, the ICC.
Yeah, you're not kidding about intense. We're talking a full-blown lawsuit, and the heart of it, defamation.
Hmm.
Mr. Reed's laying it all out in this document, his complaint, filed on March 10th of this year, 2025.
So for our listeners,
Yeah.
this deep dive, we're going to try and break down how something like this even happens, how these kinds of conflicts get so heated, especially when you've got former members of a religious group feeling like they've been, I don't know, targeted or something after they speak out or leave.
It's a good point, because this goes way beyond hurt feelings. We're talking legal action, alleging a very deliberate attempt to, wreck someone's reputation. Our mission here is to really pull apart these accusations piece by piece and see what story Mr. Reed is telling, all without getting bogged down in the legal mumbo-jumbo.
Sounds good to me. So maybe first off, let's make sure everyone knows who we're dealing with here. The guy filing this lawsuit, Gabriel Reed, he's up in Oregon, and he describes himself as a former evangelist. But here's the thing, he's also got this big online presence and influencer, YouTuber, even a musician.
Right, and that online piece is important. Now, on the other side, you've got the defendants. We start with James Michael Patterson, living in Riverside County, California, and he's an evangelist for both RCW and ICC. And this is going to come up later. He's pretty active on Facebook.
Makes sense. And then there's Chanel Patterson, his wife, right? Also in Riverside County, and she's got a leadership role, the women's ministry leader for both of those church groups, RCW and ICC. And wouldn't you know it, also active on Facebook.
It's almost like it's on purpose. And then, of course, we can't forget the organizations themselves, the big players, Restored Churches Worldwide and the International Christian Churches, both incorporated and headquartered right there in California. So you've got this one individual going up against two others in these two pretty established church groups. Should be interesting.
It is. And like we said, this whole thing hinges on defamation. That's the big accusation. Mr. Reed claims both ICC and RCW have been, and this is his wording, on a years-long campaign to trash his name, calling him a religious persecutor.
Yeah, and to make matters worse, he says James and Chanel Patterson took it even further on March 7th, 2025. They came out publicly and called him a cyberstalker. That's a loaded term these days. Serious implications.
No kidding. It gets worse, though, right?
Oh.
Doesn't Mr. Reed basically claim that this cyberstalker thing is just the tip of the iceberg? Like part of a bigger effort by these churches to just ruin his reputation?
That's exactly what he's alleging. And to understand his argument, we got to dig into something called the First Principles Bible Studies, what they often just call FP. This is key to his whole case.
Right, the FP. So, according to Mr. Reed, this isn't some optional reading group. He says it's like required learning for members, and the stuff they teach in there, he claims it's all geared towards making members see anyone who disagrees with them, anyone, as a religious persecutor. He even lists specific teachings that he says contribute to this whole us against them mentality.
And it's pretty specific stuff. Like, one teaching, he says, is that if you're truly following Jesus, then persecution is basically guaranteed. They even compare it to how Jesus was labeled brainwashed, so members should expect the same treatment. And it doesn't stop there.
Go on, go on.
Well, according to the complaint, they also teach that intense persecution, their words, can include stuff like name-calling and character assassination. It's pretty broad.
Wow, so they're basically saying any criticism, no matter how valid, is just persecution.
That seems to be the gist, yeah. And there's more. The complaint also says they teach that followers of Jesus will always be falsely accused and misunderstood, and that the root of this persecution is usually jealousy from outsiders.
Hold on, it gets even more intense, right? Because they address the whole cult label too, don't they?
They do. The complaint says they tell members that being called a cult is something to expect, and that they shouldn't be ashamed of those who call them that. It's all part of this religious persecution narrative.
And isn't there a teaching about how people will either repent, run, or persecute when they encounter these churches' beliefs?
Yep, that's in there. Basically, anyone who doesn't join them is automatically lumped in with the persecutors. And get this, they even go so far as to say these persecutors are controlled by Satan himself.
So you can see how Mr. Reed might be a little upset with this whole religious persecutor label, especially if these teachings are as widespread as he claims. It's like they've built this system where anyone who criticizes them is instantly demonized.
Exactly. And Mr. Reed argues that this sets the stage for defamation, making it easier for members to accept and believe negative things said about people like him who speak out or leave the church. It's a pretty clever, if somewhat manipulative way to control the narrative.
So to back up his claim that this isn't just a one-time thing, Mr. Reed lays out a whole timeline of events that he says show a pattern of defamation. He starts way back in 2016, April 2nd to be exact, when a guy named Timothy Kernan, who is apparently an ICC World Sector leader, published a 3-page statement.
3 pages.
Yeah, 3 pages. And Mr. Reed says this statement was totally defamatory, labeling him as, you guessed it, a religious persecutor. It even went as far as ordering all ICC members to cut off all contact with him, even on social media. And Mr. Reed specifically mentions that James and Chanel Patterson supposedly followed this order.
So this is like the first shot fired, in his view, setting the stage for everything that came after.
It seems that way. Then we jump ahead to March 4th, 2025. This is just a few days before the Patterson statement that really kicked off this lawsuit. On this date, the Superior Court of California denied James Patterson's request for a restraining order against Mr. Reed.
Interesting timing, especially because Mr. Reed had just recently gone public with some pretty serious accusations about Mr. Patterson's past, specifically allegations of sexual manipulation. So you can see how this might have set the stage for what happened next.
Absolutely, because just 3 days later, on March 7th, 2025, that's when the Pattersons dropped this bombshell 8-page statement on Facebook. And even the title is pretty aggressive. Statement on my civil harassment defamation lawsuit against a cyberstalker. Mr. Reed really zeroes in on this, claiming it's full of stuff straight out of those first principles teachings.
Yeah, that title is a doozy. And right off the bat, Mr. Reed says it contains a false statement. He points out that they didn't file a lawsuit against him for defamation at all. They tried for a restraining order, which the court denied.
Right, so he's saying they misrepresented the whole situation from the get-go, and it gets even more specific. The complaint then goes on to list a bunch of statements from the Pattersons' Facebook post that Mr. Reed claims are just plain false and intended to damage his reputation. Like one of the biggest ones is the whole cyberstalker thing. They use that word over and over like a dozen times.
And Mr. Reed argues it's a flat-out lie. He points to Chanel Patterson's own sworn testimony from just a few days earlier, on March 4th, where she said there had been zero direct communication between him and her husband for the past 10 years. So the whole cyberstalker label just doesn't hold water, according to him.
It does seem pretty outrageous, given that timeline. But that's not the only thing he takes issue with, right? What about the Pattersons' claim that he harassed them?
Yeah, he pushes back on that hard. He says the court didn't find any evidence of harassment when they denied the restraining order, so the Pattersons are just straight up misrepresenting the facts. He also points out that they claim the court validated his accusations as slander and libel, which he says is absolutely not true. The court didn't make any such ruling.
So he's basically picking apart their whole statement piece by piece. What about the part where they talk about those fake Facebook profiles? They said they were advised to create them to monitor some online forum where people were making claims against them. But I feel like Mr. Reed had a very different take on that.
Oh, yeah, he definitely did. His version of the story is that Mr. Patterson was actually told to stop using those fake profiles because it was causing problems and ethical concerns within the church's online ministry. So it wasn't some innocent monitoring operation. It was something they were actively trying to hide, according to Mr. Reed.
That's a pretty different spin on things. And it doesn't stop there. The complaint also addresses how the Pattersons talked about Mr. Reed's accusations concerning Mr. Patterson's past behavior with younger women. They claim it was all consensual and that the women involved forgave him and remained friends.
Right. But Mr. Reed challenges that narrative completely. He brings up a specific woman who supposedly contacted a legal team with some very serious allegations of sexual stalking by Mr. Patterson. So we're talking about something much more disturbing than just a few inappropriate online interactions.
And it raises questions about the Pattersons' claim that they had no knowledge of any financial misconduct within the church. Mr. Reed points out that this contradicts Mr. Patterson's own previous sworn statements, where he supposedly said that the ICC leadership was involved in financial misappropriation and covering up sexual abuse.
Yeah.
Pretty big contradiction there.
It's hard to reconcile those two statements, for sure. And then there's the part where the Pattersons accuse Mr. Reed of spreading lies about other preachers in their networks, specifically allegations of infidelity and sexual assault. But Mr. Reed pushes back on that, too.
How so?
Well, he clarifies that those accusations against other leaders aren't coming from him directly. They come from actual lawsuits and public statements made by tons of former ICC and RCW members. He even names names like Kyle Bartholomew, Thomas Kip McKeon, and Jason Dimitri, and gives some details about the allegations against them. So he's making a distinction between stuff he's saying and stuff that's already out there in the public domain.
It's all getting very tangled, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And then there's the Patterson's claim that Mr. Reed admitted to not caring about the truth, which he, of course, denies. He says the redacted messages they cite in their statement don't actually support that claim at all.
Okay. But they also said he lied about Chanel Patterson talking to him after the restraining order hearing and about Mr. Patterson offering him money, didn't they?
Yep. And Mr. Reed sticks to his guns on that one, too. He says he's telling the truth about those post-hearing events, and he even suggests that Mr. Patterson probably doesn't have any security footage that could disprove his account. As for the money, he claims it wasn't just to cover legal fees, which he didn't even have, but rather a bribe to shut him up about the whole thing. It's a messy situation.
It sounds like it. And the complaint goes on to challenge pretty much everything else the Patterson said. Like they claimed he was using drugs on camera and that he was obsessed with Chanel Patterson and stalking her online. Mr. Reed denies all of it. He even includes a text message from Mr. Patterson that seems to show him trusting Mr. Reed and being okay with his wife joining a conversation with him.
Yeah, that text message is pretty damning. And then there's that part where Mr. Reed says Mr. Patterson made comments about his wife's weight and questioned his own faithfulness. If true, that definitely adds another layer to this whole drama.
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure. But it's important to remember that Mr. Reed isn't just focusing on the Pattersons. He's also claiming there's this bigger pattern of defamation going on within the ICC and RCW, targeting anyone who leaves or criticizes the churches.
And he goes into a lot of detail about that. He lists tons of examples, naming specific people and giving approximate dates. He argues that this shows a clear and disturbing trend of silencing dissent and controlling the narrative. And he links it back to those first principles teachings we talked about, saying they basically create a framework for this kind of behavior.
Right, so it's like they're pre-programming members to see criticism as persecution, and then using that as justification to attack anyone who disagrees with them. It's a pretty powerful strategy if you think about it.
It is, and it can have devastating consequences for the people who are targeted. Mr. Reed says this happened to him, and to countless others who left or spoke out against the churches. He says they were labeled as religious persecutors, shunned by their communities, and left with damaged reputations.
So based on all this, Mr. Reed lays out three main legal claims. The first one is for defamation, and what's called defamation per se, which is basically for statements that are so inherently damaging that they automatically harm your reputation. He's saying the Pattersons calling him a cyberstalker falls into this category.
Right, and he's also alleging actual malice, meaning he believes they knew what they were saying was false or were recklessly indifferent to the truth. He's asking for both regular damages to compensate for the harm and punitive damages to punish them.
The second claim is for something called fraudulent deceit and misrepresentation, and this one names all the defendants. He's basically saying those first principles Bible studies are a deliberate attempt to deceive people, to manipulate them into following the church's teachings, and that this can cause real harm.
And the third claim is for intentional infliction of emotional distress. He's arguing that all of their actions, the defamation, the social isolation, the manipulation through those teachings, it all caused him severe emotional suffering.
So what's he actually asking for? What does he want the court to do if he wins?
Well, first and foremost, he wants money. He's seeking compensatory damages to cover his emotional distress, the damage to his reputation, and any financial losses he suffered. And then there are punitive damages, which are basically meant to punish the defendants and deter them from doing this again.
And he wants a public apology, right?
Oh, yeah, a full-blown retraction and apology from all of them, and he wants it posted everywhere that the original statements were made.
So he wants them to publicly admit they were wrong, but he also wants the court to stop them from doing this to anyone else in the future, right?
Right, exactly. He's asking for injunctions that would legally prohibit them from making any more defamatory statements about him, from using the first principles studies to coerce people, and from encouraging or participating in any harassment against him.
And of course, he wants them to pay his legal fees, which is pretty standard in these kinds of cases. So this whole thing is a huge mess. It really shows how disagreements within a religious group can spiral out of control and end up in court.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure, but it also raises some really important questions. What are the limits of religious freedom? How do we protect people from false accusations, especially when those accusations are tied to deeply held beliefs? And what responsibility do these organizations have for the actions of their leaders and the teachings they promote?
It's heavy stuff. And as this case moves forward, it'll be interesting to see how the court addresses those questions. This could have some pretty big implications for religious organizations and their members.
No doubt. And for anyone who's ever been on the receiving end of these kinds of attacks, it's a reminder that you're not alone and that there are legal avenues you can pursue to protect yourself and your reputation.
That's a good point. Well, that about wraps things up for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Until next time.